Okay, welcome to this 10th video in the online orientation for SDE Foreign Teachers for 2017-2018. Here we're going to be talking about SDE lesson planning. So in this video, we'll be talking about our purposes and expectations for lesson planning, and then how we go about planning our lessons. So what will most of our teachers be teaching? Most of you be focusing on oral English. So the standard lesson plan format that we will adopt here will be targeting oral English. If you're a subject teacher, this video may still be of some value to you, and you can consider how you might adapt our lesson plan format and the methods that we mention in here to suit your subject. What needs to be in a lesson? Well, that's a question that we're going to answer as we go through this video. And you may, of course, have your own opinions, and I would say that everything that you need to put into your lesson is going to need to go into your lesson plan. So that's why I raise this question here. What must our foreign teachers do to guarantee that all of these things are in the lesson? Well, that's what I've said. It needs to go into the plan. You need to make a plan to make sure that these things happen in your lesson. So, straight into lesson planning. What needs to be in our plan? Well, everything that needs to be in our lesson. So what needs to be in our lesson? First of all, we need to consider the content. What is the student's level? What are the number of activities we're going to be able to get done within a certain time period with that level of students? And what is their age? That will also affect what we put into the lesson. So the content, we're talking about the content of our PPTs, of our games, of any handouts, anything that we carry into the lesson, any music, what we're going to draw on the board, all of the things that we use and share with our students in the lesson, that's our content, and it needs to be appropriate to the level of our students and to the length of the class and to the age and the interest of our students. Goals, you may have seen this before, S-M-A-R-T, SMART. Our goals should be specific, measurable, achievable, result-oriented, and time-limited in order to guarantee that they are appropriate for our students and will achieve what we want to achieve in our lessons. Our materials should be well designed and also well prepared. It's all very well putting a lot of effort into developing your materials, but if you leave them in your office, then they're of very little use to you, or if you don't have enough copies of a particular printout, then it's not going to work. Then the structure of your lesson. So exactly how you're going to lay out the activities that you'll be teaching and how you're going to carry out these activities and share them and explain them with your students. And that will include certain really important things such as PPP and the timings. So let's focus in on each of those. Starting with content, we would lay this out in our SDE lesson plan framework as follows. Obviously, a title is going to tell us something about what your lesson is about. The length of the lesson is going to dictate how many activities you're going to be able to fit in. And also the age and level of the students will tell you what their attention span is, so that you can also assess how long each of your activities should be and what sort of activities you're going to need to use. Other things that are important to note here, the semester and the week. Now this might tell you, for example, with a primary school grade 1 class, how far they are advanced through the semester or through the year, and so you can make a judgment about how far their English may have progressed at this point. The number of students is really crucial here. So the number of students in your class is going to some extent influence what sorts of activities you're going to be able to complete in your class and you're going to be able to do to engage your students and activate their learning. Perhaps your school uses a particular textbook and you'll be using a particular unit or module in this lesson. Then you want to highlight which textbook you're going to be working out of and which part of the textbook you'll be focusing on. At the same time, what is the topic of your lesson? This is where we're really getting into the actual content. What is your lesson going to be about? And then what language you're going to focus on. So this can include the vocabulary, the parts of speech, the structures that you're going to focus on. So why is it important? This is setting the level of the lesson. So setting what language you're going to be focusing on, what student level you're going to be focusing on, so that you can really focus on the needs of those students and how to adjust activities and the difficulty of your class to meet their level. Also, the age of your students, their background is going to influence what they might consider to be engaging topics. So you probably don't want to have lots of fluffy bunnies and ponies for a middle school class, because they're probably going to take one look at that and say this is for babies and ignore whatever it is that you're teaching. Judging how long activities should be. So just as I said, the age of your students and also the number of students in the class will affect how long the class as a whole is going to be able to concentrate. As a general rule of thumb, you can think about the attention span of a student as being around about as many minutes as they are years old. So you could say a 6-year-old has about a 6-minute attention span. However, when you put 50 6-year-olds together in one classroom, it's surprising how, as a whole, their attention span seems to be even less. These are very important things to consider before you start thinking about the nature of your lesson, the content of your lesson, and how long the activities need to be and what sort of topics you're going to need to use. Next is goals. So we want our goals to be specific, measurable, achievable, result-oriented, and time-limited. What do we mean by these different things? We'll go on to that in a little bit of detail, but this is really our expectation for lesson goals in SDE lesson plans. And we'd like to see that in your lesson plan. Why is it important? This really focuses the design of the lesson. If you have a very specific set of goals that you're trying to achieve, then every activity that you are designing for your lesson will be trying to take your students one step closer to that goal. So really it sets out like a roadmap for your lesson so that you can see the progress of the students towards that goal, and in that way you have a measure for success for your lesson. So it's very important that you think about goals, and I would say this is one of the first things you do when you're writing a plan. You're setting out where I want my students to get to by the end of my lesson. And also this can help you to set the goals for each individual activity. So if you've got that end goal in sight, well, maybe I can set lots of mini goals that are going to get my students closer and closer as they go through my lesson. Questions to ask: where are my students going? So what is the final goal I want them to achieve? How am I going to get there? Or how will I know when they get there? So if we consider what is specific, measurable, achievable, result-oriented, time-limited, I really need to have a result in my lesson that I'm looking for. I need a result in my goals that I'm looking for. And that result is how I will know when the students have achieved my goal. Also, I need a time limit because the class is limited to 40 or 45 minutes. If I don't limit my goals to a certain period of time, how do I know I'm going to be able to achieve them within my lesson? On that note, achievability is also important. I need to set goals for my students that they can actually achieve within my lesson. Measurable. This is about saying that there is some parameter within my goal that makes it clear how I will measure the success of this goal. So is it writing 5 sentences? Is it answering 10 questions, for example? Specific, that I'm very clear in what sort of language my students are going to achieve this goal. Are they going to speak? Are they going to write? Are they going to answer questions? And perhaps what particular structures they'll be using, what vocabulary. Okay, so we can look at some examples. So students will write a 5-sentence paragraph. In this case, I have 5 here, 5 sentences. It's a paragraph. That's about it in terms of indication of what this goal is. So do I have time here? I don't have time. Do I have a result? A 5-sentence paragraph? Yes. Is it achievable? Well, potentially. I mean, it depends on the writing ability of my students. Is there a measure here? Okay, I've got 5-sentence paragraph. I'd say that is a measure. Is it specific? Well, I don't really know what this paragraph is about. So no, I would say it's not specific. I don't know specifically what the students are going to write about. Is there a measure? Yes, 5 sentences. Is it achievable? It might be. I'm not really sure of the level of my students in this case. Perhaps we can assume that yes, they're capable of doing this. Is there a result? Yes, a 5-sentence paragraph, that is a result. And then is there a time limit? No. So how long are the students going to write this paragraph for? How long do they have in order to achieve this goal? Well, it just says that they will write it. When will they write it? Will they write it next week? So let's have a look at a better example. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to write a 5-sentence paragraph describing their friend using 4 of the objectives covered today. So this is much more specific. We have an indication of what kind of language we want the students to use. And there's an extra measure here in 4 adjectives. And then we also know what this paragraph will be about. It's describing a friend. Here we have, by the end of the lesson, this gives us a time limit. So let's have a look. Is it specific? Yes, we've got a clear description of what kind of paragraph this is, what it's going to describe, what kind of language it's going to use. Is there a measure? Yes, 5 sentences, 4 adjectives. Is it achievable? Well, once again, we can't be sure without knowing the specific level of the students, but perhaps we can just assume in this case that the teacher knows them well enough and can judge what they're capable of. Then, is there a result? For sure. 5-sentence paragraph, 4 adjectives, we can measure that, we can see whether or not the result meets our requirements. And is there a time limit? Yes, this needs to be completed within the lesson. Moving on to our next component of our lesson plans, which is materials. We expect these to be well designed and well prepared. So on your lesson plan framework, there's simply a blank space here for you to fill in whatever materials you're going to need in the classroom. Why are these important? Well, you're working in a large classroom with a large class size and you have a limited time. So why does that put pressure on your materials? Well, you need to have well-designed materials that can be viewed from any part of your class, that your students will clearly understand and clearly and quickly capture the concepts that you're trying to share with them in your lesson. Also, you have limited time. So if you spend a lot of time doing board work, drawing things on the board, writing things on the board, this can take up a lot of time during your lesson that could be used to do other things. And simply being able to click on a computer and put up a full sentence on the board when you would otherwise have to scroll it across a whiteboard or a blackboard is going to save you a lot of time. Also, if you have well-designed materials that are well considered for your audience, that's going to better engage the interest of your students. So it's really important that you put quite a lot of effort into your materials, or at least into sourcing your materials. So things to focus on, so clarity of the pictures and the arrangement of pictures and language on your PPTs or in your flashcards or in any other materials that you're going to use, handouts and so on. You want it to be very clear what it is that you're trying to share with your students, and you want to make sure that the students sitting at the back of your classroom who may have glasses that aren't at the right prescription or may have no glasses when they need glasses can still read the words that you've put up on the board and can still make out the pictures, that you haven't just downloaded some pictures from Google or somewhere that aren't clear because you haven't actually put them in the correct resolution. So, things like that are really important. If you want your students to understand the concepts that you're trying to share with them and to engage in the lesson that you've given them, then you need to make sure that they can clearly understand what it is that you're trying to present to them. And part of that is font size. So always try to test out what is a big enough font size for the classroom that you're working in and the PPT or the overhead projector that you're going to be working in. Prepare your board in advance if you want to use the board, or if you want to use your PPT and your board in tandem. Then go into the classroom 10 or 15 minutes before class and make sure that you've written everything up on the board, because that time you spend writing things on the board before the class is time that you don't lose in the classroom with your limited 40 or 45 minutes every week. Okay, next, looking at structure. Now, this is a big area because this part of your plan will be really the meat of your plan, where the full detail of how you're going to carry out your lesson will appear. So here we use several columns to represent the steps and actions in your lesson. We'd expect you to share what sort of step you're taking here. So it's step number 1, it's a review of what the students did in a previous week, or perhaps it's presentation of a particular language point before we move on to practice that. What exact actions you and the students are going to take during this step in the lesson. So teacher will give instructions on a particular action. The students will take out a book and pens and so on and so forth. Then any anticipated problems and solutions that you might have during this period. So sometimes you might anticipate that students are not going to understand the instructions for a particular activity, and you might need to provide further instruction or ask some students to come to the front of the class to give a demonstration or something like this. And then finally, some indication of how long you think this particular activity is going to take. Now we can go into a bit more detail. Why is it important to have this? Well, this is where you plan what's going to happen in your lesson. So like I said, this is the meat of the lesson. It's also time to anticipate problems. So as you write this out, you will start to realize any practical issues with how you've structured the lesson, with how it might come across to the student. You might start to anticipate how the logic of the lesson perhaps doesn't quite work, or how there are certain things that really need to be communicated clearly to the students that you haven't really thought carefully about how you're going to do that. And so here you'll be able in detail to consider that and exactly how you're going to get certain concepts across to your students. Also, if you've got a nice detailed plan, you're going to go into the lesson with confidence that you know what it is that you want to do in the lesson, and also you'll have a document there that you can refer to during the lesson to make sure that you are on schedule and you're delivering your plan as planned. So things to focus on. Is there enough detail in your plan that anyone could pick it up, take your materials and walk into a classroom, follow it and teach the lesson as you've intended? That's a really good standard to try to achieve with your lesson plans. If you can do that, then you've clearly created a very effective lesson plan and you're probably going to deliver a really effective lesson. Next, use presentation, practice and production. This works really well with TEFL teaching in China, and it really suits the Chinese students' learning style. Also, it's important to put your instructions and your demonstrations along with any instruction checking questions into your plan in this phase of the plan. So here we're talking about how you're going to deliver instructions for particular activities, be it pair work or group work or any kind of solo work your students are doing, and also any kind of demonstration that you're going to want to use with your students to get more complicated concepts or activities across to them when it might be too difficult for you to explain it just in English. Finally, these sorts of instructions and demonstrations should be used in tandem with instruction checking questions. So this is the sort of thing where you've given some instructions to your students and then you want to ask them, okay, what are we going to do next? Then what are we going to do? How many minutes do you have to do this? And by asking these questions, you're encouraging the students to confirm to you the instructions that you've already shared with them. And that way you can be sure that they've understood and they know what they need to do. Next, as part of this, I want to look at presentation, practice, and production. As I said earlier, this is a method that works really well with Chinese students' learning style and also works really well with big classes. So with presentation, what you're doing is you're setting the scene for the students to then go on to practice and produce the language. By presentation, we literally mean presentation. So you would use a presentation style to explain the objective of what you're going to teach. We are going to learn about the present tense today, and then use that style to introduce that new language that you want the students to use in the class. Then you have set the scene for them and they know what it is they're working on. And as you repeat that particular structure or grammar throughout the lesson, students will already have that context established for them and they will understand clearly what your expectations are for the class. Then moving into practice. Here, you're using the language, the target language of your lesson in a controlled manner. So this could be through any number of different activities that use some kind of controlled or limited context for practicing the language. So repetition in its most simple form, simply call and respond, call and repeat, using drills with your students where they're repeating after you, using filling in the blank exercises to perhaps conjugate verbs in the present tense or to match adjectives with the correct nouns, using unscrambling exercises perhaps if you're focusing on spelling. Answering similar questions, so answering several questions in the same tense to practice answering questions in that tense and using that tense in the same way, and matching sentences perhaps to different tenses or to particular structures or questions. Then once you've practiced the language in this way and the students are particularly familiar with it and comfortable with it, that's when you move into production. And this is about encouraging your students to use the language in a more unstructured, natural way, just as they would with their native language, where they're not really thinking too much about the accuracy or the structure of the language. They're just trying to respond off the cuff. So students will use their own words, they use their own expression off the top of their head. They don't have any kind of prompts. For example, we were talking about practice using fill in the blanks. Well, you take away all of that and simply give them the opportunity to answer the question without any of the structure there. Examples of this might be working on role plays where you give a student a character and ask them to adopt that character and then behave in that way. Or you could ask students to work in groups to create a dialogue about a particular scenario. So you set the scene to them and then you ask them to come up with what the different characters would say in that situation. And another thing to focus on here is some kind of communicative task. So you might set the scene in your classroom where you are a waiter and you're going to move around the classroom and students are going to have to attract your attention and order food at a restaurant. And that is the only way that they will be able to get points in a game that you're playing. So if the students don't engage in this communicative task, then they're not going to earn these points. So they have a clear motivation to spontaneously and naturally produce language by calling you over and ordering food from the menu. Okay, that pretty much sums up all of the aspects that we'd expect to see in an SDE lesson plan. And we will share with you that lesson plan so that you can see how that fits into the video and to the expectations we set there. In the next video, we'll be talking about our criteria for lesson observation, so the sorts of things we'd expect to see when we come to observe foreign teachers' oral English lessons.